Good evening. So far in the course, we've looked at the dual issues of human overpopulation and the world running out of resources to support that population. We've looked at the fact that the way the Earth currently provides resources is through the mechanism of an ecosystem. We saw that ecosystems provide resources by capturing and recycling necessary nutrients so that they can be used over and over again by living organisms on our planet. You may recall, however, that we said that while resources can be recycled, energy cannot. For the next few chapters, we're going to deal with the issue of energy and how we are running out of that energy and what possible alternatives to running out of that energy will be for the future. As you may recall, the source of all energy on Earth is the sun. The sun radiates its energy down on our planet, and through an important process called photosynthesis, it helps to power the reaction between carbon dioxide and water that leads to the formation of our most basic organic molecule of sugar or glucose. This molecule then is the basis of all energy that is used by living organisms in order to power their life processes. And while energy cannot be recycled, it can be stored, and it is stored within the chemical bonds of this molecule. Millions of years ago, plants whose tissues were formed as a result of photosynthesis and animals who ate the plants for food died and eventually were confined to the ground. But their body tissues underwent a geologic process of compression and heating that converted them into what we now know as fossil fuels. These three fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, are in fact organic materials, and the chemical bonds that hold them together contain within them the energy that was captured via photosynthesis from the sun. We can liberate that energy by burning these three fossil fuels. However, because it took millions of years to form these fuels, they are not replaceable. They are what we call non-renewable. And inasmuch as these fuels currently represent about 3/4 of all of the energy supply that we currently use in the United States, when those non-renewable fossil fuels are used up, we are going to be in great jeopardy because we have nothing to replace them. And because we can't recycle energy, as noted earlier, we're going to have to find something to take its place or learn to do without that energy. Well, what about electricity? Why can't we use electricity? Well, the point is that electricity is what we call a secondary power source. That is, electricity is produced by burning a primary power source, such as fossil fuels. The way this is generally done is by burning the fossil fuel, we see here coal and oil being two big ones, to boil water. This water produces steam, which turns a turbine, and the turbine powers a generator, which produces the electricity. Without the primary energy source of fossil fuels, or as we'll see in the next chapter, nuclear power, you cannot produce the electricity. So if we run out of primary fuels, we will also run out of secondary fuels such as electricity. So right now, oil is king, as they say. In this graph, we're going to look at the relationship between oil production and oil consumption and how various events have affected those two things and ultimately the price of oil. If we look back to 1950, we see that the amount of oil that we were consuming in the United States was pretty much supplied by the amount of oil that we were producing in the United States. So most of the oil consumed in the United States was produced in the United States, and we were able to control the price. But over the next 70 years or so, even though the production of oil increased, our consumption of oil outstripped that increase. So that by the time we got into the 70s, we see that almost a third of the oil that we were consuming each day was being produced outside of the United States. And as a result, we became very much dependent upon other countries for our source of oil. And then a very important and dramatic event occurred, something called the Arab oil embargo. This occurred in 1973 when a number of Arab countries that were the major exporters of oil, which we now know as OPEC, got together and decided that they were going to slow down the amount of oil that was produced each day and thereby drive up the price of that oil by making it more scarce. Those of you who may have been around back in the 1970s, if any of you, may recall that this was a real shock to the American economy. In fact, we had block-long lines of cars at gasoline stations waiting to get gasoline. And here in Chicago, people actually got shot for cutting in line to get gasoline ahead of other cars. Well, one of the things that we learned from that experience is that automakers needed to produce cars that were more fuel efficient. And they began doing so because finally Americans were willing to drive smaller, more fuel efficient cars. And as a result, we see that from the late 1970s through the early 1980s that the consumption of oil went down in the United States. At the same time, we also had new oil from Alaska coming online. And this new oil from Alaska helped to stabilize the declining rate of oil production in the United States. And between the reduction in our consumption of oil and our stabilization in the rate of domestic oil, we were able to collapse the price of oil back down to a more reasonable level. And that more reasonable level held on through most of the 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s. At that point, though, we got lazy and we started manufacturing more fuel inefficient cars like Hummers. And we started we got used to the moderately higher cost of oil in the $2 to $3 range. And as a result, we were not prepared for the next time that we had problems in the Mideast that affected oil, namely the Iraq War and other Middle Eastern conflicts. And if this graph were extended, we would see that, again, we would have a significant increase in the cost of oil with regard to the availability of oil. And now for something really scary, as they said in the Twilight Zone movie. What we see here is something called a Hubert curve. Hubert curves show the amount of oil that has been produced and predicts the amount of oil that will continue to be produced in the world into some time into the future. Although it's a rather busy graph, the important thing to note is the top of the graph. And what we see here is that throughout the 1900s and all the way out to around 2000, the amount of oil that was being produced continuously increased and rather dramatically. However, beginning in the 2000s, the amount of oil that is being produced in the world is declining. And in fact, it is expected that this decline will continue out into 2030, 40, or 50, at which time there'll be no more oil in the earth from which to draw. In other words, within your lifetimes, we're going to run out of oil. And we need to be planning now on how to deal with that issue. Are alternatives to petroleum? Well, there are the two other fossil fuels, natural gas and coal. Natural gas, however, is usually found in the same deposits as petroleum. So as we use up the petroleum, we're probably also going to be using up whatever deposits of natural gas there are. So it's not really a good viable alternative. Coal, on the other hand, is found in different locations than petroleum. In fact, the United States has one of the largest reservoirs of coal. In fact, we're practically the Saudi Arabia of coal. And the deposits of expected coal on Earth are presumed to be able to supply us with energy for perhaps another 500 years. So coal is another possible replacement for oil. But because it's coal and not oil, how it is used to provide energy will have to change. Coal is a significant fuel for um, energy production companies for producing electricity, and consequently, when we run out of petroleum for conversion into gasoline to power automobiles, we may be able to turn to coal as a way of producing electricity to power electric cars. Also, there are new technologies coming online that will help us to squeeze what oil and natural gas are still left in the ground out in order to make our supplies go farther. There are things like called oil tars and oil sands and shale oil, which are embedded into rock and dirt, and which right now are prohibitively expensive to produce, but as the cost of gasoline goes up, will become more economically viable. Even now, we're talking about building a pipeline from Canada, which has the major oil sands areas for producing oil, and building a pipeline into the United States amid a fair amount of political controversy. Similarly, natural gas can be extracted from resources in the ground through the process of fracking. And again, if you're following the news articles, you know that fracking is a somewhat controversial method that some people fear may be putting pollutants into the ground as they try to remove the gas. Finally, as we have noted with other resources in short supply on the earth, if we want to make them last longer, we need to either use less of them or find ways to replace them or make them stretch. Using less of them is called demand side, and there are a number of ways that we can reduce our energy dependence. One of the simplest of which is shown in this illustration here with what we call CFL bulbs. These light bulbs use far less electricity than normal light bulbs, and they last far longer. In fact, if you get nothing else out of this course, I would highly recommend that you replace all the light bulbs in your home with CFLs. CFLs consume considerably less electricity. I know that I have reduced my own electric bill by almost 25% just by replacing the regular incandescent bulbs I have in my home with CFLs. Another thing that can be done that will dramatically reduce our national energy dependence is by getting better miles per gallon fuel usage in our cars. This can be accomplished through something called the CAFE standards, corporate average fuel efficiency. The CAFE standards prescribe what average mileage car manufacturers have to have for their fleet of vehicles. And right now, the CAFE standard for the United States is only about 28 to 30 miles per gallon. But if it were increased to 40 to 45 miles per gallon, that would be equivalent to discovering an entire new oil field in the United States to supply energy and gasoline for our vehicles. So replacing light bulbs with CFLs and increasing the fuel efficiency of the cars we drive are two particularly good ways of reducing our demand. As far as replacing the existing oil supplies, as we've noted, fossil fuels are non-renewable, and consequently we can't produce more fossil fuels. We can, however, look at other technologies for producing electricity and or producing energy derived from things other than fossil fuels. And that's the subject of our next two chapters.